There are wounds that never bruise. The cruelest is not a blow, but a sentence. Words owned like a blade and pressed into a stranger's hand, to carry to the one man forbidden to hear them. When Lady Verena sent her ward north to recite an insult to the most feared duke on the moors, it was meant to end her, broken by his rage or ruined by the errand itself. Instead, she stood trembling before him, spoke the poison she had been given, and he did the one thing no one had prepared her for. He rose and offered her the seat beside his own. Sleet came sideways off the moor, fine and vicious, rattling against the window of the hired trap like a fistful of thrown gravel. Linnet Ashby sat very straight on the splintered bench, her gloved hands folded over the sealed letter in her lap, as though it were something that might wake and bite her. She was 25. Her eyes, a pale, unremarkable brown, held the flat weariness of a woman who had long since stopped, expecting the day to improve. Her pelisse was good wool once, before 3 winters wore the nap from it. Now it did nothing against the cold that had found the seams of her hours ago, and settled into the marrow. Beneath it, she wore a gown of drab olive, let out twice and taken in once, the mark of a body that had known both a fuller and a leaner season, and no say in either. It was not the dress of a lady paying a call. It was the dress of the useful poor relation, the one who counted the linen, kept the books, and was never once invited to sit at the table she had laid. In her reticule, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth, lay the only thing she owned that was truly hers. Her father's brass pocket compass, its case worn smooth by his thumb, and now by hers. Ambrose Ashby had been a land agent, a maker of maps and keeper of other men's accounts, and he had taught his daughter to read a boundary, to hold a column of figures in her head, and to find north when the road gave her no other comfort. He had left her his cleverness and nothing else. The debts had eaten the rest. She had one gift, and she knew its exact size. Numbers did not slip from her the way they slipped from other people. A column added once stayed, added, and a figure that did not belong announced itself to her like a wrong note in a hymn. At Marcross, she kept every account Verena was too idle to keep and too proud to admit she could not. She had caught the wine merchant cheating the cellar book, and the bailiff shorting the tenants, and had been thanked for neither. A useful girl was a girl one need never pay and never praise. She had learned to expect only the work, and to hide always how much she saw. She turned the morning over in her mind the way one worries a loose tooth. The breakfast room at Marlcross, warm with a fire she was not meant to enjoy. The smell of chocolate and hot rolls she would not be offered. Lady Verena Peveril, in dove-gray silk, holding out a folded paper sealed with black wax, her smile stretched thin as paper over a grievance she had nursed for a year. "The Duke of Caldmore requires a message," Verena had said, in the voice she used for charity and for cruelty, being unable to tell the two apart. "You will carry it. You will read it to him yourself, aloud, in his own house, and you will not leave a single word out. Do you understand me, Linnet? Not one word." Behind her, her 2 daughters had pressed their napkins to their mouths. Petronella the elder had laughed outright. Sidonie had at least the grace to muffle it. Neither had looked at Linnet as at a person. They had looked at her as at a joke, whose ending they already knew. Linnet was not a fool. She knew precisely who Corwin Merrick, the Duke of Caldmore, was, or rather, she knew what the county said of him, a recluse, a man who had come home from grief the way other men came home from war, and shut his gates against the world. It was whispered that 3 years ago a fire had swept the west wing of Harrowfell and taken his younger brother, Lord Perrin, and, it was whispered, lower behind fans, where whispering does its finest work, that the Duke himself had lit it. That he had wanted the title unshared, that his silence since was not grief, but guilt. None of it was proven. All of it was believed. And the letter in Linnet's lap, she was certain, said every unspeakable thing aloud. And yet, for all the county's certainty, one detail had always sat crooked in Linnet's orderly mind. A man who had murdered his brother for a title would surely have rebuilt the wing where it happened, papered over the scorch, and moved on to enjoy what he had killed, for this Duke had done none of it. He had shut the world out and let the ruin stand, like a confession or an accusation or a grave he could not bring himself to fill. Guilt did not usually punish itself so faithfully. But she was not paid to reconcile details. She was paid to deliver poison, and she had learned long ago that a woman who wished to eat kept her observations behind her teeth. She had not read it. She did not need to. She knew Verina's malice the way a sailor knows weather. The letter would name the dead brother. It would name the Duke a murderer to his face. It was built, word by careful word, to make a violent and volatile man erupt, and Linnet was the taper sent to touch the powder. The cruelty of it was elegant, and Linnet could admire the architecture even as she stood inside the collapsing house. If the Duke flew into his famous rage, he would break the messenger, and Verina would weep prettily to all of Northumberland about the tragic girl she had tried so hard to place. If instead he merely threw her into the sleet, the story wrote itself just the same. The Ashby girl, deranged by her reduced circumstances, had forced her way into a great man's home to abuse him, mad, pitiable, unemployable forever. Either way, Verina was rid of her. And there was more. Beneath it, Linnet knew the Duke had refused to receive Verina last spring, had turned her from his gate when she came fishing to bind Petronella to his name, and had blocked her claim to the water meadows that lay between their lands. This was not only disposal, it was revenge, and Linnet was merely the instrument that could be discarded after she could have run. The thought had a certain music. But she had 1 shilling and a clipped sixpence to her name, and freedom, she had found, was a thing you bought like anything else. She had endured Verina for 6 years, since her father's grave was closed. She could endure one afternoon with an angry Duke. The trap lurched over a rut and slowed. Linnet wiped the fog from the glass with the heel of her hand and looked out, and her breath stopped in her throat. Harrowfell rose out of the failing light like something the moor had grown rather than built, vast, dark, and wrong. And there, on its western flank, blacker than the storm behind it, stood the ruin of the burned wing, its empty windows staring back at her like the sockets of a skull. The trap halted on the gravel with a grinding sigh, and the driver made no move to help her down. He sat hunched inside his sodden coat, plainly of the opinion that whatever business brought a girl to Harrowfell at dusk was business he wanted no part of. Linnet opened the door herself and stepped down into cold that reached the bone at once. She paid the man the shilling and the clipped sixpence both, every coin she had, pressed into his gloved palm, and watched him wheel the trap around and rattle away down the long drive without a backward glance, until the sound of him was swallowed by the wind and she stood alone in the falling dark with the storm at her back and the great house before her. There was no going back now. Even the road had left her. She made herself look at the place properly. The main hall stood whole and grim, all dark stone and steep slate, ivy blackened by frost clinging to the lower courses. But it was the ruined wing her eyes returned to. No matter how she willed them elsewhere, the scorched skeleton of it, and the roof beams fallen inward. 3 years of weather having done nothing to soften what the fire had made. No one had cleared it, no one had rebuilt. The Duke of Caldmore had left the wound open where the whole county could see it, and Linnet could not decide whether that was the act of a guilty man or a broken one. She climbed the wide steps. They were slick, and she took them slowly. At the top, a great iron ring hung against oak, gone silver with age, and she lifted it and let it fall. The sound rolled away into the house like a stone dropped down a well. For a moment there was nothing but the sleet hissing on the stone around her feet. Then a bolt drew back, and another, and the door opened the width of a hand. The man who looked out was perhaps 60, spare and upright, dressed in plain dark clothes kept scrupulously well. His face was closed as a shut ledger. His eyes went over her, the ruined pelisse, the sodden hem, the black-sealed letter she held against her chest, and whatever he read there did not please him. "His Grace receives no one," he said, not unkindly. "Simply as one states a law of nature." "I know it," Linnet answered. Her voice came out rougher than she meant. "I am not here to be received. I am here to be gotten rid of. There is a difference, and it works to your advantage. The sooner I am let in, the sooner I am gone. If you turn me away, I have no coin and no carriage, and I will still be standing on this step come morning, frozen to it, and someone will have to answer for the body." The old man's gaze flicked to the black wax. Something in his jaw tightened, some private displeasure held long in check. "Who sends you?" "Lady Verena Peveril." She watched the name land. It landed hard. His mouth thinned to nothing. "You know her, then?" "I know her." He said it the way a man names an illness he has already survived. Once for a moment he only looked at her, weighing something she could not see. Then he stepped back and drew the door wide. "You may wait in the hall. Touch nothing. I am Hallam." He did not ask her name, and she understood that this was mercy of a sort. A name unasked was a person he need not remember once she was thrown back out. She stepped inside, and the door boomed shut behind her, and the sudden absence of wind was so complete it rang in her ears. The hall swallowed her. It rose 2 stories into shadow, lit by a scatter of candles that did more to shape the darkness than to lift it. It smelled of cold stone, beeswax, wood smoke, and, faint and impossible beneath it all, of char, as though the fire 3 years gone had left its ghost in the very air. Linnet stood exactly where she had been placed, and let the water run from her hem into a small dark pool on the flags, and she waited. As her eyes adjusted, the hall gave up its details, one by one. A stag's skull, gray with dust, above a cold hearth. A tall clock, stopped. A staircase that climbed up into pure black. And there, absurd among the grim stone, set upon a bench as though someone had put it down mid-play and been called away, a small carved horse, its paint worn pale at the muzzle where a child's hand would grip it. Linnet looked at it a good while. She could make no sense of it at all. There were no children at Harrowfell. The whole county was agreed that the Duke lived alone with his dead. She filed the wrongness of it away with the others, and said nothing, because there was no one yet to say it to. Hallam's footsteps faded down a corridor and were gone. The house ticked and settled around her. Somewhere far off a clock counted, and somewhere nearer she went still. Somewhere nearer came the slow, uneven tread of a man who walked with difficulty and refused, from the sound of it, to be helped. The steps grew louder. They were coming toward the hall. Linnet's hands closed around the letter until the wax bit her palm. She lifted her chin, fixed her eyes on the dark mouth of the corridor, and made ready to speak the cruelest words she had ever been handed to a man with every reason to kill the one who spoke them. The footsteps stopped just beyond the candlelight, and then the dark moved, and he stepped into it. He came the last few steps into the hall, and she saw at once that he moved wrong, a heavy, deliberate hitch in his stride, the right leg swinging stiff from the hip as though the knee had been taught a lesson it had never forgiven. He carried a single candle in his left hand. His right he kept half curled at his side, and even across the hall, even in that thin light, she could see that the skin of it was wrong too, shining and puckered, roped with the pale ridges of an old burn that ran up past the wrist and vanished into his sleeve. The murderer's hand, the county would call it. Linnet found she could not stop looking at it, and made herself. He was tall, and the candlelight gave up the rest of him by degrees, the way a slow tide uncovers a rock. Dark hair worn too long, threaded early with gray at the temples. A face that had been handsome once, and was now merely severe, all hard planes, and a mouth that seemed to have forgotten the shape of any word, but no. His eyes were the gray of wet slate, and when they found her, they held her with an attention so complete it had a weight to it. "Hallam," he said. His voice was low and unhurried and rougher than she had expected, as though it too had gone long unused. "Who is she?" "She would not give her name, Your Grace. She comes from Lady Peveril." Something moved across the Duke's face at the name. Not surprise. Recognition, and a tired contempt, the look of a man who has found a wasp in a room he was certain he had sealed. His gray gaze came back to Linnet. "Of course she does," he said. "Come out of the cold, then. Whatever she has sent you to do, you will do it better warm, and I would sooner not have Hallam scraping you off my flags in the morning." He turned without waiting to see whether she followed and limped back into the dark he had come from. The room he led her to had been a library once, and was still in its bones. Books climbed the walls into shadow. A fire burned low but real in a great stone hearth, and its warmth struck her like a blow after the hours of cold, so that she had to lock her knees against a sudden treacherous shaking. 2 chairs stood near the fire, one on either side of a small table, and the Duke lowered himself into the nearer, with the careful bracing slowness of a man for whom sitting was its own negotiation. He set the candle down. He did not offer her the other chair. He simply looked at her, and waited, and let the silence do his asking. "You have a letter," he said at last. "I have a letter." Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "Then give it to me, and be done." "I cannot, Your Grace." She swallowed. "I am not to give it. I am to read it. Aloud, every word. Those were my instructions, and if I return having done less, I will have nowhere to return to." For a long moment he said nothing. The fire ticked, then the corner of his mouth pulled, not into a smile, but into something drier and older than one. "She has a gift," he said, "for making other people carry her knives. Very well, read." Linnet broke the black seal with her thumb. The cheap wax cracked cleanly. She unfolded the paper, and Verena's small, elegant, poisonous hand swam up at her in the firelight, and she began. She read that his Grace of Caldmore was surely to be congratulated on the peace of his solitude, so hard won, and at so dear a price. She read that all the county marveled how a man might mourn a brother so publicly and so long, when it was by that brother's death alone that he had come into the whole of what he now enjoyed. She read the word Perrin, and heard her own voice say it, and saw the Duke go absolutely still. She read that some men raised monuments to their dead, and that his Grace, more honest than most, had raised a ruin instead, and let it stand as the truest confession in England. She read that a fire was a convenient thing, quick and hungry, and unable to bear witness. She read at the last that Lady Peveril had found a mouth low enough to say to his face what all society said behind his back. She read every word. Her hands shook. Her voice did not. She did not soften a syllable, because she had been ordered not to, and because to soften it would have been its own kind of insult, a pity he had not asked for. When she reached the end, she folded the paper along its crease, let her hands fall to her sides, lifted her eyes to his, and waited for the storm the whole errand had been built to raise. It did not come. The Duke sat with his ruined hand open on the arm of the chair and looked into the fire, and his face, which she had thought carved from something that could not move, had changed not into rage, into something far worse to witness, a grief so old and so private that seeing it felt like trespass. He was quiet so long that the shaking she had held off at last reached her, and she stood in her sodden hem and trembled and hated that she trembled. "You read it well," he said finally, softly. "You did not enjoy it." "I have had such letters read to me before, in other rooms, by other mouths, and they always enjoyed it. You did not." He turned his head to her, and there was nothing now in his gray eyes of the wasp or the contempt. "How long have you stood in those wet clothes?" The question was so far from anything she had braced for that it undid her more thoroughly than shouting could have. "Since," she stopped, "since midday, Your Grace." "And she sent you into a storm to do it, and paid your coach one way, I should think." It was not a question. He set both hands to the arms of the chair, and she saw what it cost him, the jaw set, the breath held, as he pushed himself up onto his feet. She flinched back half a step, the old animal expectation of a blow. But no hand rose. He reached down instead, took hold of the second chair, the one that had stood empty at his side, and drew it around the table until it faced the fire close beside his own. Then he straightened, looked at her across it, and with his scarred right hand gestured, once to the seat. "Sit," said the Duke of Caldmore, "beside me, where it is warm. You have delivered her insult. You are not obliged to freeze for it as well." Lynette did not move. She could not. Somewhere, in the 6 years since her father's death, she had forgotten the grammar of the thing, the simple courtesy of a chair turned toward her, and now that it stood there, she mistrusted it as one mistrusts a bridge over a long drop. People did not give her things. They gave her tasks and letters, and the flat of a hand. She searched his scarred, unreadable face for the trick folded inside the kindness, and could not find it, and that frightened her more than a trick would have. "I do not understand you," she said, before she could stop the words. "No," the Duke agreed, without offense. "I don't imagine you do. Sit down regardless. The fire does not care whether you understand it." And because her legs had reached the end of what pride could ask of them, she sat. He lowered himself beside her for a moment. They only looked into the flames together, a duke and a delivered insult warming their hands at the same hearth. Then he spoke again, his voice gone, quiet and precise, edged like a man laying out tools. "Now," said the Duke of Caldmore, "you will tell me exactly what Lady Peveril wants. And then you will tell me what it is going to cost her that she has, instead of a scandal, sent me you." So she told him. She had expected the telling to be difficult, and found instead that it came out of her in a cold, orderly stream, the way water comes once the ice is broken. She told him that Lady Verena Peveril wanted a scandal, and that Lynette herself was merely the cheapest way to buy one. She told him the two shapes the trap could take, the Duke enraged, breaking the messenger, giving the county its proof of his violence, or the Duke merely cruel, casting her out, and giving the county its portrait of a deranged spinster who had forced her way in to abuse a grieving man. She told him that either ending rid Verena of an unpaid dependent she had tired of feeding, and that both, she suspected, were only the outer wrapping of the true gift, which was revenge. For the water meadows, the Duke said. For the water meadows. And for the spring, when you turned her from your gate and would not have her daughter. I would not have her daughter, he agreed, because I would not have anyone, and because the girl looked at my hand the way one looks at something spilled. He said it without heat, a fact filed and forgotten. So? She could not get my land at law, and she could not get my name by marriage, and so she has settled for my reputation, which she imagines I still value. The dry thing touched his mouth again. She is 3 years behind her news. I have no reputation. She is welcome to what remains. Then I have failed, Linnet said, and you have only to send me back. And she has her second ending after all. Have I? He studied her. What is your name? Your true one. Hallam tells me you would not give it, which I confess raised you in my estimation more than anything you have done since. She hesitated. A name was a small thing to surrender, and she had so few things left. But the fire was warm, and he had given her the seat, and something in her was tired of holding every door. Ashby, she said. Linnet Ashby. The Duke went still in a wholly different way than he had at the reading. He turned his head and looked at her as though she had said something in a language he had not heard spoken in years. Ashby, he repeated. You are not Ambrose Ashby's girl. It was Linnet's turn to sit motionless. You knew my father. I knew of him, which in the matter of land agents is rarer and worth more. He leaned back, and for the first time the severity of his face loosened into something like genuine interest. When I came into Culdmore, there was a boundary in dispute along the beck, the same water meadows your Lady Peveril covets now. Every agent I engaged told me precisely what I wished to hear, and charged me handsomely to hear it. One did not. One sent back a survey that said, the land was not mine, that the old maps had been drawn to flatter my grandfather, and that I should save my money and my temper. I dismissed him for it. It was 3 years before I learned he had been the only honest man of the lot, and by then he was dead. That was Ambrose Ashby. Linnet's eyes stung, and she despised the sting and let it pass. He was honest, she said. It is why he died poor, and why I was sent to you tonight with poison in my mouth. Honesty is not an inheritance one can eat. No, the Duke said slowly, but it is one I have lately had cause to prize. He was quiet a moment, and she could all but hear the machinery of him turning, some cold and careful calculation assembling itself behind the slate-gray eyes. When he spoke again, his voice had the edge from before the tool-laying edge. Lady Peveril has made an error, Miss Ashby, and it is the same error clever, cruel people always make. She has assumed she knows what I will do. She expects you returned to her, ruined. You cannot keep me, Linnet said, and heard how the words could be taken, and felt the color climb her throat. That is, she will say, I keep you for myself, yes, let her. It is a smaller lie than the one she wrote about my brother, and I have survived that. He waved the objection off with his good hand. I do not mean to keep you, Miss Ashby. I mean to employ you. My last steward robbed me for 2 years while I was too sunk in my own grief to count, and I dismissed him at Michaelmas, with nothing to replace him but a heap of ledgers I cannot bear to open. You have your father's eye, or you have not. If you have, you will earn an honest wage doing honest work, behind a locked door, and Lady Peveril's entire design will rot on the vine. She wanted you disgraced and gone. Instead, you will be housed, hayed, and useful, and she will not be able to say a single true word about it. That, Miss Ashby, is what it will cost her that she sent me you." Linnet looked at him a while. She thought of Marlcross, of the cold accounts kept for no thanks, of the 6 years of being useful to a woman who despised her for it. And here was the same word, useful, turned somehow from a cage into a key. "I will not be pitied," she said. "If you are doing this to be kind to Ambrose Ashby's orphan, I would rather the storm." "I have not been kind to anyone in 3 years," the Duke said. "I have neither the practice nor the inclination. This is not kindness. It is spite, well aimed, and a debt to a dead man, and a steward's chair that badly wants filling. Take it or do not." Outside, the wind flung a fresh handful of sleet against the black windows, and they both heard how impossible the road had become. "I cannot go tonight, regardless," Linnet said. "No. You will stay the night, and you will decide, in the morning, when you are warm and fed and can think, like your father's daughter, instead of a woman who has been standing since midday." He rang a small bell, and Hallam came, and was given quiet instructions Linnet did not quite catch. She rose, unsteady, and followed the old man out. And at the door, she paused and looked back at the Duke of Caldmore, sitting alone by his fire with an insult folded on the table beside him, and could not for her life make him fit any story she had been told. Hallam led her up the black staircase and along a corridor, and it was there, passing a shut door near the end of it, that she heard the sound that stopped her in the middle of the cold passage, with her candle guttering. Small, sleepy. Impossible. From behind the door came the voice of a child. Linnet slept against every expectation, like the dead, and woke to a gray square of window and the profound, disorienting silence of a house that wanted nothing from her. No bell. No stair to sweep before the family stirred. For a long while she lay under blankets that smelled of cedar and let herself understand, slowly, that no one was going to come and tell her she was late. Someone had left a can of hot water by the fire and a plain wool gown across the chair, worn but clean and very nearly her size. She dressed and found her way down by memory and her father's instinct for the shape of a building, and when she reached the library, the Duke was already there. 3 towering stacks of ledgers waiting on a cleared table beside his own. "You have not gone," he observed, not looking up. "The road has not gone anywhere. I can follow it," she said. "And I find I would rather audit your disaster than freeze in Lady Peveril's. Where do you keep the steward's daybook?" The dry thing at his mouth deepened almost to warmth. "Bottom of the 2nd stack. God help you." He pushed the inkstand toward her side of the table, and that small motion, the sharing of an inkstand across a shared table, settled something in Linnet's chest that had been unsettled for 6 years. She sat, opened the first book to its ruinous first page, and began. She had been working perhaps an hour and had already smelled the first wrongness rising off the columns like damp off a wall, when the library door was pushed open by a hand far too small to belong to Hallam. A child came in. She was perhaps 4, dark-haired, in a nightgown and one stocking, dragging a blanket in her wake and clutching in her other fist a small carved horse, worn pale at the muzzle. She stopped at the sight of Linnet, enormous gray eyes going round, and Linnet's breath caught, for they were the Duke's eyes exactly, set in a small, grave face that had never learned to be severe. "Briony," the Duke said, and every hard edge Linnet had heard in his voice was simply gone from it. You are meant to be at your porridge." "Horse wanted to see the lady," the child announced with the unanswerable logic of the very young, and crossed the room, and to Linnet's astonishment leaned her whole warm weight against Linnet's knee as though they were old confederates. Linnet, who had not been leaned upon by anyone in her life, sat very still. Over the small dark head the Duke looked at her, and she watched him decide to answer the question she had not asked. "My brother's daughter," he said quietly. She was 10 months old when the West Wing burned. Her mother did not leave the nursery in time. Perrin went back for his wife. A muscle moved in his jaw. I went back for Bryony. And there it was, laid plain between them. The true history of the hand the whole county called a murderer's. He had gone into the fire. He had come out of it, carrying a child and wearing those burns for the rest of his life, and had lamed himself under a falling beam doing it, and society had looked at the scars and the sudden solitary dukedom and decided the marks of his rescue were the marks of his crime. Linnet looked down at the little girl leaning trustingly on her knee, and at the carved horse, and understood that a man does not spend 3 years in ruined seclusion guarding, with his own scarred hands, the living child of the brother he is supposed to have murdered for gain. The whole edifice of the rumor fell in on itself in an instant, silent and complete. "She is why you do not rage," Linnet said. "When they read you the letter, you have learned to swallow it whole, so that she never sees it on your face." The Duke did not answer, which was answer enough. He came and gathered the child, horse and blanket and all, and bore her off toward her porridge, moving slow on his bad leg, the little girl's arms locked trustingly round his neck. At the door he paused. "Find me my thief, Miss Ashby," he said, and it was not quite a command, and not quite a plea. "I am tired of being robbed in my own house." She found him his thief before noon. It was not clever hiding, it was only that no one honest had looked in 3 years. Mr. Crail, the dismissed steward, had run a simple and patient scheme. Each quarter he had billed the estate for repairs to the tenant cottages and the March fences, materials and labor both, and each quarter Linnet could match the sums to nothing on the ground, because her father had taught her that a fence is not a figure in a book, but a thing that stands in a field. The cottages along the beck, the ledger swore, had been re-roofed twice in 2 years, 2 roofs. She would have wagered her father's compass not a single slate had been lifted. He had shorted the tenants their due, and billed the Duke for kindnesses never done, and pocketed the daylight between. It was the shorting of the tenants that had caught her first. A steward who merely cheats his master keeps the rents honest, for the rents are watched. Crail had grown greedy at both ends, trimming a shilling here and 2 pence there, from men too poor and too frightened to complain. It was those small, mean subtractions, too regular to be error, that had drawn her eye up the column to the larger theft above. Cruelty, she had learned long ago, keeps tidier books than kindness. £460, she told the Duke that afternoon, laying the proof before him in 3 tidy columns any magistrate could follow. Perhaps more. I have only reached the spring of last year. He billed you for a world that does not exist. You have been paying, twice over, for roofs that leak to this day. The Duke looked at the columns for a long time. He did not shout. He looked, if anything, profoundly and quietly satisfied, the look of a man handed at last a single solid fact after 3 years of standing on fog. "Your father's daughter indeed," he murmured. "Draft the letter to my solicitor. Crail will give it all back, or he will give it back from a cell. Gladly." But Linnet did not move to sharpen a fresh quill. She sat looking down at the day-book, at one line among the hundreds, and a cold small finger of unease traced its way up her spine. "There is one more thing," she said slowly. "It may be nothing." She turned the book so he could see. This entry, the quarter of the fire, a payment out, and a large one, not to a tradesman but to a private agent, for services the book does not name. I would not have marked it, except that I know the hand that signed the receipt. She looked up at him, and the warmth of the morning had gone very far away. "I copied that same signature 100 times at Marlcross, Your Grace. It is the man who keeps Lady Peveril's secrets." The days at Harrowfell fell into a shape, and the shape was work. Linnet rose with the grey light, breakfasted with the Duke and the child, and spent the hours until dusk unpicking 3 years of Crail's careful lies. The house learned her. Mrs. Otterby, the housekeeper, thawed from suspicion to gruff approval, and began building the study fire higher than the Duke had ever troubled to order. Bryony discovered that the new lady could be coaxed into drawing horses in the margins of the blotting paper, and took to installing herself and the carved horse beneath Linnet's table each afternoon, a warm, confiding weight against her ankles. And the Duke, who had not spoken 4 sentences a day to anyone in 3 years, found he had a great deal to say to a woman who answered him in figures. They argued the price of slate, agreed about almost nothing, and enjoyed it enormously. Twice Linnet caught herself laughing aloud in that grim room, startled at a sound she had not made in years. It could not last, and it did not. The carriage came on a bright, hard morning 10 days in, wheels loud on the frozen drive, and the knock that followed was the knock of a man who has never once been made to wait. Linnet knew it before Hallam opened the door. She had heard that exact, self-important rapping across 6 years of Marlcross mornings. Sir Marmaduke Cleves swept into the hall in a coat of primrose superfine cut, for a man 20 years younger, his cravat piled to his ears, his eyes already narrowed on her. He was Verena's cousin, kept in coats and cards by her purse, with the particular cruelty of a small man sent on a large person's errand. Linnet he did not bow. "Good heavens, look at you, playing clerk in a murderer's house. You will fetch your things at once. Lady Peveril has been more than patient. There is talk of a suit, abduction, alienation, the corruption of a gentlewoman under her lawful care. You have made yourself the scandal of the county, you foolish girl, and I have driven a very great way in the cold to save what scrap of you can be saved." "You have driven a very great way," Linnet agreed, "to be disappointed." "I am not under Lady Peveril's care, Sir Marmaduke. I am not under anyone's. I am the steward of this estate. I am paid a wage, in coin, for honest work, a thing that house never once offered me. You may recite my stepmother's cousin's version of the law to a magistrate whenever he likes. I keep the books now, and I should be delighted to show him mine." Cleves' face went blotched. "You insolent, you are a fallen woman. Do you understand what that means? You will die in a ditch. He will tire of you by summer and turn you out, and there will be no one to take you in." He took a step toward her, one gloved hand rising as if to seize her arm and haul the argument to a close. "I would not," said the Duke of Caldemore. He had come in silently, as he did everything now, and he stood at the mouth of the corridor with his scarred hand loose at his side, and something in his face that Linnet had not seen there before, not the cold contempt he had shown Verena's letter, but a still deliberate menace he wore like a coat kept in a cupboard for exactly this. He did not raise his voice. He let the county's own worst lie do the work for him. "You have come into the house of a man, they say murdered his own brother," the Duke said softly. advancing on the smaller man with his uneven, unhurried tread. "You have said as much, in his hall, to his face. You have raised your hand to a woman under his roof. I confess, Sir Marmaduke, I am curious. What is it you imagine such a man might do next, alone, in a large house, on a morning when the ground is too hard to dig, but not, I think, forever?" Cleve made a sound like a kettle. He did not answer. He backed toward the door with his ridiculous cravat trembling, roped for the latch, and was gone down the steps and into his carriage so fast he left one primrose glove lying on the flags. The wheels tore away over the frozen gravel and dwindled into nothing, and the hall was quiet again. Linnet let out a breath. She had not known she held. Her hands were shaking, not with fear now, but with the enormity of it. She had just severed, out loud and past mending, the last thread that tied her to the only family she had ever known. There was no house in the world behind her now. The Duke saw it. He did not offer comfort, which she could not have borne, nor tell her she had been brave, which would have been a lie. It had not felt brave, only necessary. He stooped with difficulty and picked up the abandoned glove, and considered it. "He will run straight to her," he said, "and she will understand at last that her clever little joke has failed in every particular, that you are not ruined, not returned, and not afraid. A woman like Lady Peveril can forgive a great many things, Miss Ashby. She cannot forgive being made to look a fool." He dropped the primrose glove on the hall table. "She will come herself now. It is only a question of when and of what she brings." "Then let us not wait to find out," Linnet said. "Your Grace, the payment in Crale's book, Scarrett's signature. I think it is time we learned exactly what your enemy's man was paid to do the quarter your brother died." The Duke looked at her, and something shifted in the pale gray eyes, some door long shut, easing open on the possibility of an answer. "Yes," he said, "I believe it is." And that night, for the first time in 3 years, the Duke of Caldmore sat down and wrote to his solicitor and told him to start turning over stones. She learned the date the way one learns the location of an old wound, by watching a strong man begin, very quietly, to favor it. It came on toward the middle of February. For a week the Duke had been sinking back into the silence Linnet had first met at his door, the words drying up between them, the dry humor gone. He worked longer and slept less. He snapped once at Hallam over nothing, and apologized for it, which frightened the old man more than the snapping had. And Bryony, who could not have remembered and yet somehow knew, grew clinging and strange, refusing her porridge, waking twice in the night for no reason her nursemaid could name. Linnet did not ask. She had been under enough grief-struck roofs to understand that some anniversaries are not to be spoken to, only survived alongside. But she counted the days as she counted everything, and so she was not surprised, 3 nights later, to wake in the small hours to the sound of a child crying somewhere down the black corridor. She was up and moving before she had decided to be. The house was bitter, the fires banked, and her breath smoked in the light of the candle she carried. She found the nursery door ajar, and the nursemaid absent. Gone for warm milk, she would learn later, and Bryony, sitting bolt upright in the tangle of her blankets, cheeks wet, the carved horse clutched to her chest, sobbing the boneless, terrified sobs of a very small child who has woken into the dark and found it endless. "There now," Linnet said, and gathered her up without ceremony, blanket and horse and all, and sat on the edge of the little bed with the warm, shaking weight of her pressed close. "There now, I have you. It was a dream, and dreams cannot follow you out of the dark. I know the way out. I have a compass. Did you know that? My father gave it me. It always points home." She did not know, until she said it, that she had brought the compass with her. But there it was in her dressing-gown pocket, and she pressed the cold brass into the small hot hand, and the child's sobbing hitched and steadied and slowed as she turned the wonderful heavy thing over and over in her fingers. It was there, in the doorway, that the Duke found them. He filled it, dark, against the darker corridor, and Linnet knew at once that he had not come from his bed. He was still dressed, for chalk. There was a smell of cold ash on him, faint and terrible, and she understood without being told that he had been where he went on this night every year, down to the ruined wing, to stand in the burned dark under the open sky where his brother had died, and keep the vigil that the whole county had decided was a murderer's guilt and was in truth only a brother's grief. He looked at the child, quiet now in Linnet's arms, and something in his ruined face came apart. "She should not wake to that," he said, low and hoarse. "She should never have to. I have spent 3 years making certain she should never, and tonight I could not even—" His voice failed. His scarred hand rose and pressed flat against the doorframe, as if he needed it to stand. "She is asleep," Linnet said softly. Bryony had gone heavy and slack against her, the compass loose in her open palm. "Come, not here." She carried the child to her bed, and tucked the blanket to her chin, and set the carved horse to keep watch on the pillow. And then she took the Duke of Coldmoor by his sound arm, and led him out into the corridor and down to the dying study fire, because a man that broken should not be left standing in the cold. And because she had come to know that pity is a poison and presence is a cure, and that the two are easily confused only by people who have never needed either, he sank into his chair. She built the fire back up with her own hands, unhurried, and when it had caught she sat down, not across from him but in the chair beside his, the seat he had given her that first night, and hers now by long custom, and she did not fill the silence, and she did not look at him while he wept, which he did at last, silently, a strong man's weeping. Dot at Abel and dry. "They think I did it for this house," he said when he could for the title, "as though I would not burn every stone of it to the ground with my own hands to have him back. I dismissed the warnings, Miss Ashby. The flue in that wing smoked. Perrin told me. I meant to see to it in the spring. I was busy, I was." His breath tore. "I was a fool with all the time in the world, and it cost him everything. And the county looked at what my carelessness had done, and called it my ambition, and I let them. Do you know why? Because a murderer at least chooses. A murderer is not merely a man who forgot to mend a chimney. I would rather they thought me wicked than know I was only negligent. Guilt, it turns out, has its vanities." Linnet was quiet a moment longer. Then she reached over in the firelight and took his scarred right hand in both of hers. He went rigid. No one touched that hand. He had told her, without words, a dozen times that no one touched it. He hid it in company, curled it from view, kept it always at his off side. She turned it palm up in her 2 hands, and looked at the ruin of it. The shining seized skin, the fingers that had never straightened since, and she did not flinch, and she did not let go. "This is not the hand of a man who forgot a chimney," she said. "A forgetful man does not go back into a burning house. He does not carry a 10-month child out through fire and take a falling beam across his own leg doing it. You did not cause that fire, Corwin. A cracked flue and a hard winter caused it. What you did, the only thing you did, was run toward the people you loved when every sane instinct said to run away. They have got your story exactly backward. The hand they call a murderer's is the hand that saved the only piece of him left in the world. She closed both of hers around it. I have been keeping accounts my whole life. I know the difference between a debt and a theft. You owe grief. You do not owe guilt. The books are wrong, and I will not have wrong books in my study. He made a sound at that, half a sob, half impossibly, a laugh, and turned his hand over in hers, so that for the first time it was holding rather than held. The firelight moved over both their faces. He looked at her as though she were the first true figure in a column of lies, and she felt the whole careful architecture of her caution lean and sway and begin to fall. He lifted his other hand and touched her jaw exactly as he had that first night gestured her to the chair, and drew her in, and she went, closing the space between them, until she could feel the warmth of his breath and the whole of the future tilting toward a single point. And then he stopped. His forehead came to rest against hers, and there they stayed, not quite touching, both of them shaking now. No, he said, rough and ruined and achingly gentle, not like this. Not while you are mine to dismiss, and this house is all that stands between you and the ditch that fool promised you. I will not be one more person who took something from you in a room you could not leave. When it comes, if it comes, you will be free to say no to me and mean it and lose nothing by it. I owe you at least that. I owe your father at least that. Lynette closed her eyes, her heart a wild and painful thing, and understood that she had just been refused by the first person in her life ever to refuse her out of love rather than contempt, and that it was somehow the most tender thing anyone had ever done for her. On the pillow down the hall, a carved horse kept its watch. In her pocket, the compass pointed, as it always did, at a home she had stopped believing she would ever have. Then hurry, she whispered, and set me free, and did not know herself which freedom she meant. They did not speak of that night. There was no need, and Lynette had never trusted words half so far as she trusted what people did when they thought no one was counting, and she was always counting. So she noted, instead, the evidence. The Duke began to rise earlier, and to shave, and once she caught Mrs. Otterby smuggling a jar of hothouse quince into the breakfast things, and understood that it had been asked for. Winter loosened its grip by slow degrees. The beck came unlocked and ran loud below the water meadows, and the first hard green spears of snowdrop pushed up along the ruined wing, softening even that black wound with a little living white. Lynette's own reflection, glimpsed by accident in the hall glass, startled her. The pinched gray look she had worn for 6 years had gone somewhere, and a woman she did not quite recognize looked back, warmer about the eyes, standing straighter, as though she had at last been given permission to take up room in the world. Bryony took her lessons onto the study table and then promoted at the small desk beside Lynette's own. She learned her letters slowly and her figures with a quickness that made the Duke look up from his correspondence with a soft, arrested expression Lynette pretended not to see. "She has your eye for a false sum," Lynette told him, and he said, "She has her father's laugh," and neither of them said the other thing, which was that a house with a child learning her numbers in it is not a house of ghosts, but a house of the living, and had been for some time, and that they had built it without noticing between them. In the evenings, a new ritual took shape without either of them proposing it. When Bryony was abed, the Duke would carry the day's correspondence to the fire and read it aloud in his low gravel, and Lynette would sit in the chair beside his, always that chair, and catch the errors and evasions the way a mill catches grain, and between them the estate came back to life, letter by letter. Once reaching across for a document, his scarred hand covered hers on the arm of the chair, and neither of them moved it, for the length of a burning log. That was all. It was enough. She had spent her life among people who spent words like water, and meant none of them. She found she could live a long while on one still hand laid over hers, and nothing said at all. And underneath the quiet, the stones were turning. The letters came from Mr. Frost, the solicitor at Alnbury, at first cautious, and then, week upon week, sharper with the scent of something real. A man had been sent north to Berwick and beyond, following the cold trail of a Harrowfell groom named Ned Faulds, who had left the county with unexplained suddenness the very season of the fire. His silence bought with more coin than a groom sees in 10 years. Scarrett's name surfaced in a wine merchant's dispute, and again in a bill of sale, each time a little less shadow and a little more man. Linnet laid the fragments end to end on the study table as they arrived, the way her father had taught her to lay a survey, and slowly, line by patient line, the true map of an old crime began to draw itself. Frost's latest carried a warning beneath its lawyer's caution. The trail was old and fragile, and should Faulds take fright, he would go to ground again somewhere no coin could follow. They were racing something now, though Linnet could not have said precisely what. Nearly, the Duke said one bright March morning, standing at her shoulder over the spread pages. He no longer hid his scarred hand. It rested now easy and unremarked on the back of her chair. "We are nearly there, are we not?" "Nearly," Linnet agreed. Her heart was full to a degree she had learned to be wary of, for in her experience the world took particular pleasure in emptying full hearts. One sworn word from Faulds, one receipt with Scarrett's hand on it that says plainly what it bought, and then no one in England can call you a murderer and be believed. She should have known better than to say a happy thing aloud. She had scarcely finished when Bryony, at the window, announced with a child's bright indifference to consequence, a carriage, a big shiny one coming up the hill. Linnet rose. Through the glass, small and glittering and unmistakable on the long drive, came a traveling coach of deep burgundy, its lamps flashing in the spring sun, its team fresh and driven hard. She knew it. She had polished its fittings with her own hands. "She has come herself," Linnet said quietly, and felt the whole warm spring go cold. "Your Grace, Lady Peveril is here." Lady Verena Peveril came into the hall of Harrowfell as though she had bought it and found it wanting. She wore deep burgundy velvet and Russian sable, and the spring light did her no favors, showing the powder caked in the lines beside her mouth, and the hard, bright avarice in her eyes. Sir Marmaduke Cleves slunk in at her heel, keeping furniture between himself and the corridor where the Duke had last frightened him. Verena looked at Linnet in her good wool gown with ink on her fingers, and her chin level and her face curdled. "So," she said, "the reports are true. My charity case has installed herself in a madman's house, and imagines the arrangement flatters her. I have come to be merciful, Linnet, which is more than you deserve. Fetch your things. There is still a version of this in which you are merely foolish and not wholly disgraced. But it closes today, and only if you do exactly as I say." "Good morning, Lady Peveril," Linnet said. "You may say what you came to say. His Grace and I are at leisure to hear it." The familiarity of that His Grace and I struck Verena like a slap. Her eyes narrowed, and she abandoned the pretense of rescue for the thing beneath it, which was, as it had always been, appetite. "Very well. Plainly then, since the girl has forgotten her place." She turned to the Duke, who had come to stand at the foot of the stair, and had not yet said a word. He wore his grief and his scars openly, and watched her with the flat, patient attention of a man watching a snake decide to strike. "Your Grace, you have made me the laughingstock of 3 counties." You would not receive me. You would not entertain my daughter. You blocked my lawful claim to the Beck Meadows, and now you keep my ward in a manner that has every drawing-room in the north whispering that I bartered my own ward to a monster. I did not come to be insulted further. I came to be paid." "Paid," the Duke repeated. His voice was very quiet. "The Beck Meadows signed over entire, and £4,000 for the damage your conduct has done my daughter's prospects." She smiled, thin and certain. "In exchange, I will call off the suit my cousin has so ably prepared. Take the girl quietly off your hands, and let it be understood there was never anything here but Christian charity toward a grieving man. You will have your peace, I will have my due. And no one, your grace, need ever again speak aloud of what happened in that wing 3 years ago. She let it land where she meant it. The county has a long memory for fire. It would be a pity to feed it. There it was, laid bare in the spring light, the whole engine of her and the single lever it ran on. She had come to sell him back his own reputation, a reputation she had made worthless on purpose, certain to her marrow that the lie was still hers to release or withhold. The Duke of Caldmore considered her. And then he did a thing Lynette had never seen him do before. An enemy. He smiled. "Miss Ashby," he said, "would you be so good as to bring the table?" Lynette had it ready. She set the small table between the Duke and Lady Peveril, and laid upon it, one by one, the fruits of a winter's patient work. Crayle's daybook, open to the page, a sheaf of Mr. Frost's letters, 3 receipts in a cramped particular hand, and last, a single document, heavy with a fresh notary's seal, still smelling of the road. "You are an educated woman, Lady Peveril," the Duke said. "But allow me to spare you the figures. Miss Ashby is better at them than either of us, and she assembled the whole." He touched the daybook with one scarred finger. "My former steward Crayle, whom you know, for he was in your pay before ever he was in mine, kept honest accounts of his dishonesty as such men do. Here is a payment, the quarter of the fire to one Josiah Scarrett. You know that name. He keeps your secrets. His hand is on hath these papers." And here he lifted the sealed document, and his voice did not rise. And that was the terror of it, is the sworn statement of Edward Faulds, lately a groom of this house, taken 3 days ago before a magistrate in Berwick, where your Mr. Crom. Scarrett's money at last ran out. Verena had gone the color of tallow. You cannot. Faulds was in the yard the night the wing burned, the Duke went on, inexorable. He saw me carry my brother's child out through the smoke and go back for Perrin. He saw a man run into a fire, Lady Peveril not out of one. Then a soft-spoken gentleman gave him £30 and a passage north, and warned him the Duke's family would see him hanged for negligence if he breathed a word, and so the only witness to the truth vanished, and the story you preferred was left standing in the space where he had been. You did not light the fire, you did something a court will find almost as black. You found a grieving man at his lowest hour, and stole his good name while he was too broken to hold it, for a meadow and a grudge. And you have come today to sell it back to me." The silence rang. Cleve had gone very still by the wall, the look of a man who has just understood which way the wind sets. "This is slander," Verena managed. "The word of a bought groom against 3 receipts, a steward's own book, and Scarrett's signature repeated in a dozen places, which Miss Ashby can match in her sleep, having copied it for you these 6 years. The Duke set the statement down gently, which was worse than throwing it. "Shall I tell you what happens now, or would you prefer to guess? I take this to the assizes at Newcastle, not the tame magistrate your cousin has been flattering, and lay it before men who cannot be dined into agreement. Subornation. Conspiracy. The manufacture of a capital slander against a peer. Your name in every paper you ever schemed to be seen in, not as the martyred widow, but as the woman who tried to hang an innocent man's memory to steal his water. Your daughters unmarriageable, your credit gone. The Beck claim laughed out of chancery, and every soul who ever bowed to you, doing sums, Lady Peveril, exactly as Miss Ashby taught them, and arriving at the same total, that it was you all along. Verena's mouth worked. For the first time in Linnet's long acquaintance with her, no words came. "Or," said the Duke, "you may go home today. You will drop your suit. You will sign the full retraction, Mr. Blank. Frost has already drawn, which Miss Ashby will witness before you leave this hall. You will never again speak my name, or my brother's, or hers. And you will pray, every night of your remaining life, that I remain a man who prefers his peace to his revenge, for I hold the whole of you now in a sealed box, and I have grown very tired of being merciful to people who mistake it for weakness." He paused. "The child sleeps upstairs, by the way. My brother's daughter, the living proof of everything you sold. You walked past her nursery to come and threaten her home." "I would think very carefully, Lady Peveril, before you said one word more." Whatever cruelty had risen to Verena's lips died there. She looked at the sealed statement and the receipts, and last of all at Linnet. Linnet, whom she had sent north in a threadbare pelisse to be destroyed, and who now stood straight-backed at a duke's side with the instrument of her ruin arranged in 3 neat columns. Something in her face collapsed inward, the arrogance falling away to leave a frightened aging woman who had wagered everything on other people's fear and lost. She signed. Her hand shook so that the retraction was barely legible, but she signed, and Linnet witnessed it in a firm, clear hand, and Cleve fairly fled to hold the carriage door. At the threshold Verena turned, some last venom gathering, and found the Duke of Coldmore watching her with those pale grey eyes, and thought better of it, and went out into the spring without another word. The Burgundy coach turned on the gravel, and rolled away down the long drive, smaller and smaller, until the moor swallowed it whole. It was over. 3 years of it, and 6 of Linnet's gone down the hill in a shiny box. Linnet stood in the sudden enormous quiet, and felt the thing she had least expected, not triumph, but a cold hollow opening beneath her ribs. The thief was caught. The name was cleared. The books were balanced at last, and she understood, with the pitiless arithmetic that had never once failed her, that she had just finished the very work that had bought her a place in this house, and that she had no idea, none at all, what she was to him now that it was done. The Duke found her an hour later in the study, where she had gone the way a wounded animal goes to a familiar corner. She was not weeping. She was doing the thing she always did when the ground moved under her. She was working, squaring away the papers of the case into neat tied bundles, making an ending of it with her own hands so that no one could make one of her first. "You need not tidy those," he said from the doorway. "Frost will want them as they are. Then I will label them so a stranger can follow the order." She did not look up. "You will want everything in a state another man can take over. A proper steward, now one you can own to, openly, in daylight, with your name restored. You will not have need of a woman keeping fictions behind a locked door." She heard her own voice, brisk and hollow, laying out her own dismissal before he could. The last defense of a life spent bracing for the blow. "I have a little put by from the wages, enough to reach York and take a position. Why, I keep good books. I shall not want a character, I think." After this, no, the Duke agreed. you shall not want for anything. After this, which is rather my difficulty." He came into the room and stood across the desk from her, and waited until she was forced by simple courtesy to lift her eyes, and when she did, she found his face open in a way she had never seen it. The armor not merely set aside but gone, and under it something unguarded and frightened and resolved. "I have been trying since the coach left the hill," he said, "to work out how to say this so that you will believe it is not pity, and I cannot, because there are no words that a woman who has been given nothing but scraps will not first suspect of being one more scrap. So, I will simply say it plainly and let you audit it afterward, since that is a language we both trust." He drew a breath. 3 years ago, I stopped being able to find my way. I do not mean the leg. I mean that I woke every morning in a house I had turned into a grave, and I could not have told you which direction was forward, or why a man would walk in it. I kept the ruin standing because it was the only honest thing left in my life. And then, a soaking, furious, half-frozen woman was pushed through my door with a knife in her mouth that she did not want to hold, and she read it to me without softening it and without enjoying it, and something in this house that had been stopped for 3 years began, very quietly. Linnet's hands had gone still on the papers. "You did not fix my accounts," he said. "You fixed the hour. You gave a grieving man his brother back, not his life, I know that, but his name, which is the only part of the dead we are left the keeping of. You taught my brother's daughter her figures, and let her sleep through the one night of the year she has never once slept through. You took my hand, this hand that no one will touch, and told me the books were wrong, and made me believe it." He came around the desk, then slow on his bad leg, until he stood close before her. "You told Bryony that your father's compass always points home. I have not had one of those in 3 years, Miss Ashby. I begin to think it is you. Corwin, I am not offering you a steward's chair, I am offering you the other one. The one beside mine that you have sat in every night since the first. But for the whole of your life, and by right, and not by my leave, so that no Marmaduke Cleave, and no Verena Peveril, and no drawing-room in England, I am offering you my name, which you and no one else made worth having. Again I am asking you to marry me." His voice roughened. "And because I told you once you would be free to say no and lose nothing by it, I mean it. The position is yours regardless, the wage, the room, the locked door, all of it, for as long as you wish. Whatever your answer, this I ask for myself, and you owe it nothing." For a long moment, Linnet could not speak at all. She had spent her whole life learning to want nothing, because wanting was a door. People used to hurt you, and now the thing she had not let herself want stood before her holding it wide and telling her she was free to walk through or not. "It is not pity," she said. "It was not quite a question. I am famously incapable of pity. You have said so yourself in this room, and you are never wrong about a total." A sound broke out of her that was half a laugh and half something wetter, and not duty to my father. Your father would be appalled. He thought me a fool who wouldn't take an honest survey. He was right. He lifted his scarred hand, slowly, giving her every moment to step back, and cupped her jaw as he had that first night by the fire. "Ask me the real question, Linnet. You have never once shrunk from a true figure. Do not start now." So she asked it, the question under all the others, the one she had never dared put to a single soul in 6 years of standing behind other people's chairs. "Do you want me?" she whispered. "Not the steward. Not Ambrose Ashby's clever orphan. Me." "I want you," the Duke of Caldmore said. "Past sense, past pride, past every wall I built to keep the world out, which you walked through in wet boots on the worst night of your life, as though it were nothing. I want you in the chair beside mine until we are both too old to add. I want to hear you laugh in this grim room until it stops being grim. I have wanted almost nothing for 3 years, and I find I want this so badly it frightens me now. Audit that, and tell me your answer." Linnet Ashby, who had come to Harrowfell with 1 shilling, a clipped sixpence, and an insult she had been ordered to deliver, looked into the slate-gray eyes of the man the whole world had called a monster, and she had proven a hero, and she gave him the only answer the figures would support. "Yes," she said, and then, because 6 years of caution do not die in a day, and because it made him laugh, that startled, disused laugh she had come to live for. "Yes, but I keep the books." "You keep the books," he agreed, and kissed her at last. There in the study that was no longer grim, the compass warm in her pocket pointing, as it always had, at exactly where she stood. How long they stood so, neither could have said. It was Bryony who ended it, wandering in with the carved horse to report that cook had made seed cake and no one had told the lady, and finding her uncle and the lady in an attitude that made the child beam with the uncomplicated certainty of the very young that all was, at last, exactly as it should be. "Are you staying?" she demanded. Linnet knelt to the small gray Merrick eyes. "For good," she said. The truest sum she had ever entered in any book. They were married. In May, in the small grey church at Nethercote, with the moor gone gold, with gorse all around it. Linnet did not wear white. She wore a gown the deep blue of the beck under a summer sky, and she carried no bouquet but her father's compass, tucked into her glove, because she was a practical woman, and saw no reason a bride should not know which way was home. There were no lords in the pews. Hallam wept without shame into an enormous handkerchief. Mrs. Otterby pretended not to. Bryony, entrusted with the ring, carried it the length of the aisle on the back of the carved horse, and delivered it with immense gravity, and when the vicar named them man and wife, the Duke of Caldmore did not offer his new duchess a chaste and public peck. He drew her in against him, scars and grief and all, and kissed her as though he had been waiting 3 years to learn how, which, in a manner of speaking, he had. The truth ran through the county faster than the slander ever had, for the world dearly loves to be told it was wrong about a thing in a way that lets it feel generous. Fald's sworn word and Verena's own retraction did what 3 years of the Duke's silence never could. The man they had whispered was a fratricide, became overnight, and to his profound discomfort, the man who had gone back into the fire for a 10-month child and worn the proof on his hand ever since. Invitations he had no intention of answering began to arrive. Strangers bowed in Alnbury. He loathed all of it, and bore it, because it meant that Bryony would grow up in a county that knew exactly what her uncle was. Lady Verena Peveril did not recover. Society, which had feared her, discovered it had never liked her, and turned with the particular savagery of the newly freed. Her credit failed. Her daughters married beneath the hopes she had ruined herself to raise. Within the year she had let Marl Cross, and removed to a narrow house in Bath, where she was said to speak to no one of her northern relations, and no one, mercifully, thought to ask. And at Harrowfell they did a thing the county talked of longer than any of it. They cleared the ruined wing. All that spring carts came and went, and the blackened beams were carried away, and where the grave of the west wing had stood, they made a walled garden, sheltered and sunny, with a low door Bryony could open herself. They did not forget what had happened there. They simply refused at last to let it be the only thing the house remembered. Perrin and his wife got a white stone under the beech, and the living got roses. On a warm evening at the summer's end, Lynette sat at the great oak desk in the study. Her desk now, the Duke had surrendered it, claiming her filing had colonized his, and totted up the quarter's accounts, which were, for the first honest year in a decade, comfortably in the black. Through the open window came the sound of Bryony shrieking with laughter in the new garden, and her husband's low voice pretending to be a bear. His scarred hand, she knew, would be perfectly steady on the child's. It always was now. Crat. She thought, as she sometimes let herself, of a girl in a threadbare pelisse, in a hired trap, with a shilling, a clipped sixpence, and a sealed insult, and no future she could bear to look at, being sent north to speak the cruelest words she knew to a man with every reason to destroy her. She had been handed a sentence meant to end her. It had turned out, against every law of the world she had known, to be the first line of the only story she would ever have wanted, and the man it was meant to enrage had heard the whole of it, and risen, and offered her the seat beside his own. She had been sitting in it ever since. Lynette dipped her pen, entered the final figure, and found the books, at long last, balanced. If Lynette and Corwin's long climb out of the dark warmed something in you, if you cheered when the woman everyone underestimated laid the truth out in 3 neat columns and watched a cruel schemer's whole world come apart, then do us a kindness and tap that like button. It truly helps this little channel grow. Subscribe and ring the bell so the next story finds you the moment it's told. And tell me in the comments, what was your favorite moment? The seat by the fire, the hand she would not let go, or the day the coach rolled back down the hill for good? I read every one. Until the next tale, be well and remember, the people who count you out have simply never seen you do the sums.